Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Philosophy, Religion, and Humanities Roundtable. This roundtable is about safety, the human need for safety, and about boundaries and about borders. And it's sort of an open discussion about how safe those things can actually make us feel. Harrison Green will be our moderator today, and he is going to have a stack so that each of us will have a turn, and we ask for a turn. I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned two events that are coming up next semester within our Philosophy Forum. On Tuesday, March 3rd, in this room, which is Eastview 8500, we have Buddhist Ethics Part 3 with Carolyn Bottler. Carolyn has been doing a really incredible series on Buddhism, and you can also check out the past videos on this live stream. On Wednesday, April 22nd, at the SAC South Austin Campus Multipurpose Room, there will be Ethics of Climate Change by Wade Allen. So those are some upcoming events that we would like you to be aware of. So I guess I can go ahead and introduce myself since I have the mic already. My name is Sarah Lynne Bowman. I am a humanities professor at ACC, and I also have been involved in helping to construct safety culture in my field of study, which is role-playing games. So I have been involved in helping to manage and create events for role players and trying to figure out how to build safety culture within those kinds of spaces. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm afraid I may have more questions than answers at this point, even after 10 years of doing this stuff. So.
I'm Azzurra Crispino. I teach philosophy here, mostly ethics and logic. My non-ACC life is that I'm the co-founder of an organization called Prison Abolition and Prisoner Support. So I do a lot of work with prisoners, and in terms of the theoretical spaces that I live in, how to rehabilitate people who have committed sexual assault and what it means to prevent sexual assault. So I talk a lot about consent, compromise, and things of that nature from an abolitionist perspective.
My name is Erin Bannen. I'm a humanities professor. How many of y'all are in philosophy class? Philosophy class? Awesome. Humanities? One humanities. Welcome. Thank you, my people. I am here in this particular roundtable because my background, I'm an actor by trade. So I went to school to be an actor, and there was a theater class called Theater for Social and Cultural Awareness at UW-Madison where the professor had everybody sit down and write about a time when they felt like they were the only person in the room. And that professor had us come to class the next day, and everyone shared about the time that they felt like the only person in the room. And it was the first time that I'd ever been in a group of people where everybody felt comfortable sharing and everyone felt comfortable talking. And I've spent the rest of my career trying to figure out how that happened. Like, how did that professor get people to open up in that space, and how did that professor get people to listen after they opened up to each other. So my master's degree is in improvisational theater because I thought that there was an answer in that, and there was. But I'm still very much studying how people feel safe being vulnerable with one another in classroom spaces, in personal spaces, and in lots of different spaces, creative spaces especially. But my point of origin is definitely acting and creative writing, so that's sort of, that's my home space. I also am very, 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 very in the LGBTQ community. And since today is Transgender Day of Remembrance, I was trying to think of a good way to commemorate that. And the best way that I know how to commemorate stuff is with art. So I found a piece from an incredible trans artist. Her name is Sarah June Woods. It says here on her website, is a gay transsexual mess and also her own person. So I'm going to read two excerpts from a piece that she wrote called Sea Witch, and it's in honor of Transgender Day of Remembrance. So here we go. When I was living in Sea-Witch, I organized my life around the same principles many people living in Sea-Witch did, the most important of which was, when they come for us, we will climb the trees. This one is very old, and the origin is unknown. I don't think anyone ever told me about it. When you get to Sea-Witch, there are certain things that you just know. The whole time I was living in Sea-Witch, I kept a stone in my pocket, wrapped in old paper I tore from a book and held together with hair ties. Every night I would wash it in Sea-Witch's hair and feed it bits of mushroom and herbs, whatever I had around. When I spoke to it, I felt listened to. Before I left Sea-Witch, I gave that rock to Sea-Witch as a present, and she ate it, saying, "I will keep it safe here." I wrote her a thank you note and signed it with all of my names. I kissed Sea-Witch and felt the rock moving inside. When they come for us, we will climb the trees. Thanks for letting me read a poem to commemorate Transgender Day of Remembrance. And I feel like now we're going to move into discussions, yes?
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what this day represents?
This day represents the fact that statistically trans folks are far more likely to be murdered in the world, way more likely than other LGBT folks. And when you're in a community that feels like it's under attack, and then one of yours dies, one of yours is murdered, that hits hard. And grieving is difficult and complicated. So that's what today is about. Today is about an attempt at complicated and difficult grief. You're welcome. Go team.
And I am Harrison. I will be moderating the stack, and just to explain how that's going to work, it's pretty straightforward. I have a list of topics here. I'll introduce one, and then I believe Sarah will introduce the topic, I guess. And whenever one of the panelists has something they would like to contribute to the conversation, they'll just raise their hand, point at me, give me a stern look, and I will just write their names in order and go through the stack in a first in, first out way. Pretty straightforward. Ready to...
Thank you for moderating for us.
Absolutely.
Appreciate you.
The first topic, safety, what does it mean to you, internal versus external?
Yeah, so I thought each of us could think about what it means to us. Mm-hmm. For me, the reason I said internal versus external is because as an abuse survivor, I sometimes experience PTSD. And that means that even when I'm in a very safe environment, I may feel completely unsafe all of a sudden. Learning how to create safety internally and externally has been a journey throughout my life, really, an ongoing journey. And the truth is that a lot of people have trauma, either complex trauma or other kinds of PTSD, that is untreated and unrecognized. And I think that raising awareness around the way that trauma can hijack the nervous system of the body and make it very difficult to be able to function is really important. And learning different kinds of skills for how to communicate or at the very least learn how to ground when in that state are important. So that's the internal piece for me. The external piece is thinking about how we construct interactions and social structures that can make us feel more safe. Safety to me is a perception. There are clearly times when we are physically unsafe, but a lot of times it's a perception of safety. And there are ways that we can consciously create community, and I think all three of us are very invested in that, that can help people have a greater sense of safety. Now, does that mean that they are literally safer? That's an open question. But as somebody who encourages people to take creative risks and to explore parts of their identity, it's difficult to take risks when you don't feel safe. So creating safe spaces is a way for us to help people expand into who they're going to be next.
Lady Gaga. Who knows Lady Gaga? People? Yeah? Yeah? Who likes Lady Gaga? Anybody? Who hates Lady Gaga? No haters. Okay, that's good. Lady Gaga gives a really great definition for post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic memories, which is if you have a traumatic memory and you've been diagnosed with PTSD, and even if you haven't been diagnosed, when trauma happens, your brain will take that memory and box it away, and sometimes that box can be in the back of your brain for years and you don't know about it. And your brain is being really smart because your brain is going, okay, like a car crash is a great example. So if you've been in a car crash, I've been in a car crash. A semi drove me off the road. And all I remember is the sound of my voice. I was screaming. So I remember like a really weird scream, like I'd never screamed that way before. And then the next thing I remember was a guy opening the door of the car going, hey, how's it going? Doing okay? And like this poor gentleman had parked his car, walked to me. My car was totaled. Like it was gone. I wasn't injured. But he just walked up to this car like it might have, like this brave human being opens the door and looks inside, and I was just holding the wheel like that. And I don't remember anything that happened in between the scream and the guy coming over and being like, yeah, how's it going? How you doing, friend? Doing good? And that memory's in my brain back there, and it might come out at some point. I don't know. But I have other traumatic memories that I'm not comfortable sharing that have come to light. And the way that your brain handles it is like, okay, it was like, Erin, we need to get you through this car crash, so we're not going to focus on the creating memories in like a normal way. We're going to box this. We're going to take all the memory making stuff that we normally have, throw it into the back, and get you through this to make sure that you survive. And then maybe later you'll go and open those boxes and figure out what happened. There's really good, well-documented science about how traumatic memories are created and how they can pop up. And when they do pop up, your body relives the memory. So it's totally possible that when my brain unpacks what happened, the way it'll come up for me is I'll be in a classroom teaching, and all of a sudden my body will 100% believe that I'm in a car crash. Like they've done the studies. The cortisol goes up, my adrenaline will go up, and my whole physical body will be like, you are gonna die, fix it. And that will not be the case. I will be in a classroom with students that I love, talking about topics that I love, but my body will suddenly, for whatever reason, feel like I'm in a car crash. And that is a really interesting thing to throw into what does safety mean? Because I'm a PTSD survivor and I'm a trauma survivor, and so I understand how that happens, and I can sort of get a handle on it for me. But if the question is, how do I create a classroom space where trauma survivors feel comfortable and safe, I don't know what that looks like. And I'm really excited to talk about it because I have been in classrooms where I've seen it done, I think, well, and I've been in classrooms where it's been done not well, and I'm yearning for resources to look at how to create classrooms that can handle this kind of brain thing that I have. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about it, but I wanted to give you guys sort of a background into what traumatic memories are and what trauma is, and Lady Gaga has a great way of explaining it, and The Body Keeps the Score is a great book that will give you all the sciencey bits.
In terms of the internal notion of safety, I take great comfort in a line from Aristotle, which is that courage is having the right amount of fear of the right things for the right reasons. If you don't have enough fear, then you're foolish. If you have too much fear, you're a coward. And this is particularly useful when I'm dealing with situations where my feeling of safety does not match up to the actual situation. So, for example, as a rape survivor, I was working on a paper called Can't Unrape, Restorative Justice, Transformative Justice, and Sexual Assault, and I needed to do research for the paper, right? Where do you go to do research for papers? You go to the library. Now, as a college professor, I am very comfortable in libraries. But I needed to go to the library at the university where the person who had assaulted me had worked at the time that the assault occurred. So my level of fear regarding going to this library compared to my actual risk of being hurt in the library was completely and utterly mismatched, right? So the creation of an internal notion of safety for me basically included having to right-size the situation. It also required having support. So even though I didn't necessarily need an escort to go to the library, a friend was kind enough to talk to me on the phone as I was approaching the library, right? And then eventually I got down to doing the library things that I needed to do, and I was able to say, okay, it's legitimate and appropriate that I have this level of fear regarding this situation, right? Considering my narrative, it makes perfect sense. And yet there was also a desire for me to reclaim that space as being a place that I could be and could inhabit safely. So I wanted to say that with regards to the internal notion of safety. In terms of the external, I think that often we're in situations where we want to manage conflicts. We want conflicts to just kind of go away, be swept under the rug. But I think that in order to create external systems that are safe, we need to make sure that conflict is actually resolved. And that means helping people, empowering people to have scripts for what does it mean when a conflict arises, to be able to mediate that conflict so that the conflict is actually resolved versus just put on the back burner. And what does it mean for us to interrupt what would be the seeds of that conflict in such a way that the conflict doesn't even get a chance to grow up to be a full-blown plant. And speaking of plants, I think a very useful metaphor comes from gardening. So if we're talking about creating a safe space, imagine that what we mean is that a weed popping up is an unsafe situation. One way that we can weed a garden is the moment that you see a weed, you go and pull it, right? So somebody acts unsafely, we remove them or we disrupt the situation. Another way, though, to have a garden without weeds is to make sure that we have lots and lots and lots of plants that are growing that are the plants that we want. So in other words, to create spaces, to create situations, to create paradigms and patterns of safety, so that when someone behaves in an unsafe way, there's almost like this built-in shield, right? Where we're already used to doing things in a very safe way, and here you are acting unsafe, and there's just going to be kind of this natural, almost immune response, right? Of, no, we don't do it that way.
And there's safety in numbers, Yeah, that makes sense.
In role-playing, we call that herd competency. So when enough of the herd are used to being able to manage conflicts, say, then it can carry everyone else that maybe hasn't developed those skills yet.
Okay. I wonder about, I love that the herd has like this, I love the idea of really amazing communicators being in a space and someone not, what does that person do though? What is the person, if I'm the weed, what do I do when I look around and there are all the amazing flowers and I feel like, oh crap, I screwed up, what did I do? I like the herd thing, but I also want to know what to do with the weeds. I think you have the most compassionate answer for that.
I think that something that I had meant to say a little later is that I think that we often think that we create safety by removing the bad people. And I don't believe in the existence of bad people. I think that given the right set of circumstances, I could be a murderer. But to quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil runs through each and every one of our hearts, right? That we're all capable of good, we're all capable of evil. So I think that part of it is, instead of thinking of it as the person is the weed, to think of it in terms of the behavior is the weed. right? So I can make it clear to someone what you just did was uncool in a way that doesn't make them feel as a person
that they are a weed.
Uncool.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
I think it really depends on the behavior. I think there are certain behaviors where it's a lot easier to make those sorts of corrections or to call out those sorts of behaviors and hopefully have a learning moment for everybody. I think there are certain behaviors that fundamentally make other people in the classroom feel unsafe or in the environment unsafe, and that requires a more serious response. And I am the kind of person that would prefer to keep the weed there and let's water the weed. Like how can we teach the weed to be a flower and all of that? And I tend to allow behaviors to occur for far longer than they probably should. And so I've had to be in positions where I'm the person that says, I'm sorry, weed, but you can no longer be here because some of my flowers want to leave because they don't feel safe in the space. And that is a horrible position to be in because essentially I have to decide who I value and where my values are. And there aren't easy answers to that. And ultimately, I had to make a decision that I need to protect vulnerable populations. Those are people from marginalized backgrounds and prioritize that. And I needed to protect, this is very hard to talk about, thank you for listening. I needed to make sure that I protected people who actually haven't been a weed first. Meaning, by focusing on trying to rehabilitate somebody, I might actually be alienating somebody else and taking them out of an activity that's really personally meaningful to them when they haven't actually committed any sort of transgression. And that's a really painful situation to be in. Now there is an alternative, which is restorative justice, which is something that you mentioned. And I'd love for us to be able to talk a little bit about that because it seems like a promising avenue for handling things in an alternative way. I will say that my understanding of restorative justice, and I'll let Azzurra explain it in more detail, but is that everybody has to be on board. So if certain flowers are not comfortable with it, that it doesn't work, right? The whole community has to kind of be on board with reintegrating the weed back into the society. So would you feel comfortable talking a little bit about it, or Erin, would you like to?
My comment is gone. Please go.
So I think that where you and I perhaps disagree is that I think that the aggressions, whatever, may they be microaggressions, may they be something that seems really minor, need to be addressed proactively and immediately, and that part of what we need in communities is scripts for how to do so, okay? Whether that's, one of the common ones is the sandwich approach. So you say something kind to someone, then you tell them that that was completely inappropriate, and then you say something else that's kind, so that you kind of sandwich the interruption. In certain cases, you just have to really just shut it down, the behavior, without shutting down the person. And I think that that can be done immediately. A story from the classroom that kind of crosses my mind. I had a student who had been in a class, had been disruptive, then ended up enrolling in a second class for me. And it was clear that the student had not checked the roster because on the evaluations had said that I don't have a sense of humor. Now, for the record, I'm hilarious, right? So clearly that wasn't the issue. And
how did you know it was them when they wrote the thing?
Oh, it was a class where they turned in a lot of handwriting, so I could recognize the handwriting sample. And I asked my department chair,
Take notes, students. We are paying attention.
Yeah, I'm probably going to get in trouble with this, but I asked my department chair, what do I do? And my department chair said, well, you need to shame the student. And I said, no. And then he came back and said, no, that's not precisely what I meant. But I just said, that's not the kind of classroom that I run. And what ended up happening was the student said something that was genuinely funny, and I looked at the student and said, student name, that was really funny. I'm so glad that you finally said something funny. And the class laughed longer and in a more sustained fashion than I have ever had a class laugh in 15 years of teaching. And after that, the student was a lamb.
Wow.
So it doesn't have to be a put down. In that particular moment, I gave a compliment. Students laughed. Now, perhaps you could say they laughed at the student. It didn't feel mean or mean-spirited. It just felt like the students were saying, she's funnier than you. But that was enough to fix the situation. So I would caution against thinking, oh, we need to nurture the weed. I do think that when weed behavior occurs, we have to systematically and immediately respond. Now that takes training, y'all. Like, this is not something that you're just going to get up and learn how to respond to this kind of situation. And in certain cases, the response is actually to give positive attention to the person who's being harassed. So for example, let's say that we're on a train and we notice that a woman who's wearing the hijab is getting harassed by someone who's being Islamophobic. The training that is done in that disruption, in that situation, is not to deal with the aggressor at all. It's to go and wave and give positive attention to the person who is being harassed and be like, oh, hey, we were looking for you. It's so glad that we can sit together, right? And then basically that gives a level of protection, right? That's a stranger situation, stranger danger. You don't necessarily want to get in somebody's face, especially if you don't know if they're carrying a weapon or something. But that's nevertheless an intercession. So I think that part of what we need to do in order to build external safety is learn how to be first responders to situations where people are being made unsafe, and be really good at being initially vocal so that we don't get to the point where we then have to, and I want to be very careful in phrasing this, I ultimately come from a very strong position on this. I don't believe that we build safety by removing people, but I do think that we build safety by discouraging behavior, and that's kind of the hard line that I draw. Sorry if I'm going over time on my stock. You talked about restorative justice. So restorative justice talks about the idea of going back to what things were like before the transgression occurred. I, as well as others, have actually sort of abandoned that model to move towards transformative justice. And basically, in terms of my own personal experience, for example, we can't restore me to the person that I was before I was assaulted. That would make no sense. I don't want to go back to being 16 years old. But at the same time, do we need to transform the situation? Absolutely. Okay, so what might transformative justice look like? It would be not just healing this particular situation, but also transforming the circumstances that led to it. So that's probably a very basic way to kind of thinking about the difference between restorative justice might be a baseball goes through a window. We need to change the window, right? Restore it to before the baseball went through it. Transformative justice might ask, why, where are children playing baseball, and what do we need to do to change the situation such that this ball does not go through a window in the future?
Sarah?
Yeah, I wanted to backtrack a little bit to the student in the classroom in the comment and talk about some different strategies. The first, you may have heard of calling out versus calling in. In that situation, it's sort of subtle, but it feels more like a call out in that you are in the view of other people, calling out a certain behavior as undesirable in a subtle way, in a way that is amusing and that perhaps creates an atmosphere that's more pleasant to be in. Okay, so you did, right. So calling in is when privately you have a conversation with someone and say, this behavior isn't working for the following reasons, or this behavior is making someone in the classroom feel unsafe. And I think we have a tendency to call out quite frequently, particularly in social justice circles and progressive circles. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, in that I think it's good to be the person on the train that comes and helps somebody, and to be visibly that, because that way they feel like they have social support, and that increases their feeling of safety. But I think in terms of conflict, I want to say transformation skills, in terms of ways that don't just resolve conflict, but actually work towards a positive outcome, like imagining a positive future. Sometimes working with somebody individually can be easier, and actually can be maybe have more avenues, in that they may not lose as much face if they're being called out in public. Often people will escalate if they, and because they feel more defensive. There's more at stake if things become public. And I'm not saying that we should sweep everything under the rug and we shouldn't have transparency and all that. But one of these skills is learning when is it actually going to be more harmful to the community at large to make things transparent, and when it's better to handle things underneath. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. And I also wanted to kind of open up the topic around codes of conduct, because we've been talking about creating safer spaces, and the term safer space basically just means no space will ever be fully safe, but we can try to intentionally construct communities that feel safer. And a code of conduct is sort of a mission statement, in a way, for what you want the community to be like, and what sorts of behaviors are encouraged and what sorts of behaviors are not acceptable. Codes of conduct tend towards protecting minorities, especially the way that they're phrased in many circles. So essentially they are there to say, these kinds of behaviors are not acceptable here, and there may be a consequence should you behave in this way. Codes of conduct are not fun. I have spent years editing and re-editing a code of conduct. They're extremely nuanced. They have a lot of thought that goes into them, and a lot of logistical features to really get right. Some people have very basic codes of conduct that seem to work for their communities. That's great. Some people think codes of conduct make them feel less safe. Like they read a code of conduct and they're like, oh, I'm going to be thrown out of this community immediately based on these rules. You know, the slightest thing I say wrong, I'm going to be removed. And this goes to your point. And then other people will not even attend an event if there's not a code of conduct. So codes of conduct are kind of varied in terms of how safe they make people feel and who feels most safe in those spaces. So I just wanted to ask what y'all's thoughts were about codes of conduct. Have you used them in your communities or in your classrooms? And if so, to what, how did they go?
I haven't used a code of conduct in my classroom, and this is my good. I love that we have a stack, y'all. It makes me so happy. I love that we have a moderator. I feel less afraid of talking. So a couple of people have walked in since I said what I said at the beginning of this, and I'm so glad you're here. Welcome. My answer to codes of conduct, I've tried to figure out, so I started this by saying I've spent years and years and years trying to research how this one thing happened in a classroom that one time, and that one thing that happened in the classroom one time was a bunch of people talked about really vulnerable experiences, the times when they felt like they were the only person in the room, and that for some people that was they were the only woman in the room, for some people that was they were the only person of color in the room, for some people that was they were the only person with an invisible disability in the room, they were the only person whose parent died of cancer in the room. Like, everybody shared a time when they felt like they were the only person in the room, and I was fascinated by how did this happen? How did we get to a point where people felt comfortable sharing, and then where people felt comfortable listening? And the answer after years and years of research is when you have a group of people, especially actors, but it doesn't have to be, and you make them play improv games for 2 weeks together. And improv games are basically those horrible get-to-know-you games, like, make your name, like, Aaron, my name is Aaron Eggplant, and then you go to the next person, like, my name is Karen Kittering, or something. Like, it's just ridiculous, silly games that you have to play, and everyone feels dumb and stupid when they're playing them. But there's such power in the feeling dumb and stupid, because everyone feels the same level of dumb and stupid together. And that makes this, like, magical thing happen, where everybody feels a little bit uncomfortable all at the same time. And in that class, we did nothing but improv games for 2 weeks. All of us were in this room together, feeling dumb and stupid together, and it was painful, but we didn't feel like we were alone. And we had been dumb and stupid so many times that we knew that the world wasn't going to end if we said the wrong thing or if we asked a question that was silly. So someone, someone had questions about transgender identity and what that means, and they had questions that had to do with biology, and they felt really silly asking them, and they didn't want to offend anybody, and they were able to, we had established a sense of, like, hey, we're all in this together, we're all, like, trusting of one another. I don't see your question in this particular space. I don't see your question about biology with regards to transgender issues as a threat, because we've done 2 weeks of work making sure that everybody feels like we're in this together and connected. And so I haven't used a code of conduct to answer the question, but I do have this tool that can be used with groups of people under 20. And none of my classes are under 20 people, and so I'm still trying to figure out how to do this in groups of more than 20 people, and I don't have a good answer for that, but I know that one way, or one entry point into creating a space where people feel comfortable talking and making mistakes is, you do that. I've heard of teachers having everybody go, like an art teacher told me once that he had everybody go to the front of the room, first day of class, and draw the ugliest drawing they could. They wanted to just, like, the worst piece of art that they could possibly draw, and then they critiqued them for which one was the worst, and the worst one won. I've heard of math teachers saying, okay, first day of class, everybody has to go to the board and solve a problem incorrectly. You have to put 2 + 2 = 7. You have to go up there, you have to put 2 + 2 = 7. English teachers will say, go up there and put a sentence that's grammatically incorrect. Like, starting off with, and this is, ideally I would just play improv games with my students for 2 weeks before we did anything. But when you have a group of 36 students, it seems like intentionally making mistakes before you make the real mistakes is a way to create a community where everybody kind of feels like they have skin in the game.
I think codes of conduct are great. I think that the limitation of a code of conduct is I can know what the rule is, but when I find myself in this situation, then a lot of us are going to go into the fight, flight, freeze.
Yeah.
I was totally looking over your shoulder.
Yes! I wrote that down.
And what ends up happening is you don't necessarily know how to respond, even though you have this set of rules, right? And I wasn't planning on bringing this much Aristotle to the game today, but one of the things that I really like about Aristotle is that he says, look, there's a limitation to rules. Because when you find yourself in a situation, you're not going to stop, say what's the rule, apply it, you're going to react. And so he says that we need to create habits, right? So when I talk about training, what I mean is, what does it mean for us to think of ourselves as safety first responders? What does it mean for us to actively think of ourselves as being somebody who builds safety? And this is where I think theater, and specifically, like, to get theory-headed for a moment, Auguste Ball and theater of the oppressed and role-playing is incredibly, incredibly useful, is that it gives us a chance to physically practice. Because I can give you a code of conduct that says, if a student cheats, this is what you do, right? I mean, a syllabus is a code of conduct. We all have those.
That's true.
But that doesn't necessarily tell you, okay, these are the resources that you give a student in order to prevent plagiarism. This is when you find yourself with a student who's plagiarized, how you're going to have that conversation with them. That takes practice. that takes embodiment, that takes habits. And so I'm more focused on how do we build relationships, because in a situation where we have relationships, if somebody acts in an uncool way, it's different if you don't know each other versus somebody that you happen to really, really like. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you already have beef with someone and they step on your toe, you're going to be like, okay, that's it, we're fighting. Whereas Sarah steps on my toe, I'm going to be like, oh, let's dance, right? Because we already have this continuing cooperative relationship. I really like Sarah, right? So there's a way in which the building of the relationships both prevents wrong action and, like you were saying with the we've already made mistakes, right, it lowers the fear that we have in terms of intervening, which kind of, I think, helps to overcome that fight, flight, or freeze, which is the one that everybody always forgets about, right? So when we think about situations where somebody acted inappropriately and there were 100 people who could have interceded and nobody did, what do they always say? Well, it just happened so fast. And yet for the nurses or the paramedics in the room, right, if I were to have a seizure right now, chances are you wouldn't respond, but hopefully there's a paramedic or a nurse in the room that would respond to me having a seizure. Why? Because you have practiced. So what does it mean for us to practice situations of safety? And that's, I think, a question that role-playing can help us answer.
I'll just very quickly recite a quote that I like that's very relevant to this. In moments of crisis and panic, we don't actually ever rise to the occasion. That's not a thing. We fall to our highest level of preparation. Sarah. Oh, sure. In moments of crisis or pressure, we don't ever actually rise to the occasion. We fall to our highest level of preparation. Sarah.
Yeah. So I would like to talk a little bit about role-playing, and I'd like to put a quick plug for the Peace and Conflict Studies Center, which this is a Peace and Conflict Studies event, who we do skills training around conflict resolution and conflict transformation. So that is something that is available at this institution, and it's something that we would like to build out more and are actively planning on doing. There's an entire degree plan for peace and conflict studies if you're interested in becoming a mediator, say. There's all sorts of jobs in peace studies, so yeah.
If I wanted to get training, what would my first step be? I'm legitimately interested.
Yeah, you can contact Shireen Khosropour. She's not, unfortunately, isn't here right now because she's been in Washington doing really important work this week. But she's the head of the department. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, head of Peace and Conflict Studies Department.
Yes. It is very difficult to know what to do in the moment. And I've been involved in designing role-playing scenarios for nurses in crisis de-escalation. I've been involved in creating scenarios for role players, community organizers and players to practice how to handle situations as they come up, because everybody has very strong opinions about how things should be handled. But when they're actually put in the situation, even people with 20 years of experience were doing these scenarios and were like, I didn't know how to handle that. Whoa, you know, that's a realization of how under-equipped we are in a lot of ways to be able to handle crisis. And I do think it's something that people should prioritize. I think that it's important to figure out how to live together in this society, whether we're in crisis or not. It's important to be able to learn how to acknowledge when someone else has a need that might feel threatened in a moment and try to figure out how to address that need. And that's one of the things we do in peace and conflict studies is we look beyond the surface level of the conflict and look beneath and say, what need is being activated here that this person feels isn't being addressed. And one of the things we learn in the training is that safety is one of those needs, security. It's a very primal response oftentimes when we feel like our safety is in jeopardy and things can escalate. So role-playing is an incredible skill because it allows you to practice similarly to improv, except it's not so much about being silly, it can be, but sometimes it can be quite serious, but it allows for that failure to occur within a trusting environment where there aren't real stakes. I mean, at least the stakes are much lower. And Harrison was actually involved in helping us run some of these. I was wondering if you wanted to add your experience with that.
I was actually just thinking of how useful exercises like that are, of practicing what to do in a situation where there's some sort of breach of consent or trust or ethics in some way. Like, for instance, for me personally, I've recently realized that I need more practice with what do I do when one of my colleagues makes a off-color joke that like people shouldn't be making. Like, oh, it's just a joke. How do I, like, what's the best way to respond to something like that? And really like in the moment, you freeze and you go, oh, I let that person say a not great thing in front of me and I should have done something. So practicing it makes it to where it's just, that's the response. I think that's extremely valuable. Erin.
So we've been talking about fight, flight, and I have this thought, right? So when you have like, if someone's coming at me with a gun, trauma response, bring it, friend.
We're going to role play this out.
Yeah, right. The fight or flight are the two most sort of talked about trauma responses. A trauma response that women use a bunch is fawn. So there's fight, flight, and fawn. Fight is, I guess let's not go with a gun. Let's say, I don't know, someone's a colleague. Let's say this has never happened, but let's say a colleague is really upset and yelling at me, and I'm like, okay, I could fight back, and I feel like that my brain wouldn't do this because trauma brain is like, we're gonna go to the best, closest thing, which for me is not fight. It's not, hey, why are you yelling at me, you jerk? Like, I feel okay fighting you and defending myself. It's not that for me. It's also not flight. I don't feel like capable of running. It's definitely freeze. I've got some freeze in me for sure, but it's also so much fawn, which is, oh my gosh, thank you so much for bringing this to my attention in this completely inappropriate and not okay way. I'm floored by your intelligence. I so appreciate that you're bringing me this feedback. Thank you so much. You're amazing. And I'll do that until I can get the F out of there. So fawn is a response that especially women have learned it'll get me out of a threatening situation, and the aggressor in that situation leaves the situation thinking, I did a good. She appreciated everything that I just did. Go me. And the me leaves the situation needing to process some trauma. And so I think, I'm not saying, I have no value statements or value judgments about theoretical aggressors or anything like that. I just think it's important that just so many women have told me, I never knew about the fawn response. I've been doing that my whole life. Now that I'm aware of it, I can make different choices. But it's a really good way to get out of a traumatic situation, potentially. I also wanted to say, to your quote, say the quote again.
In moments of panic or crisis, we don't
Yes.
ever rise to the occasion.
Yes.
We fall to our highest level of preparation.
Yes. So in The Body Keeps the Score, which is a book on trauma psychology, the trauma psychologist talked about how a woman with a black belt was sexually assaulted. She knew how to kill somebody. She practiced killing people, not like actually killing them, but like, she's a black belt. Like, she's passed enough tests to prove that she can mess you up if she wants to. and she was sexually assaulted. She could, so this, in this community that the psychologist was referencing, they realized that protecting yourself from an aggressor isn't just a practicing of physical stuff, it's also a practicing of mental stuff. So this discussion of being trained in crisis situations is really relevant, because what the community ended up doing was having self-defense classes where people with lots of padding would come at someone, as the aggressor, and the person would be trained in, disarming the person essentially. But there was a mental and a physical component. And the psychiatrist talked about how one of the sexual assault survivors in the course was mugged. And I'm not saying this is what anyone should do. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do what this person did. She told the story as a victory. 2 men came to her at night and said, "Give me your wallet." And she got into a fight stance and said, "Look, guys, I've been waiting for this to happen, and I'm ready. Bring it on." And then they ran away. That's not what you should do when someone asks for when someone asks for your wallet. You throw it and run away because fighting escalates. But the psychiatrist used it as a reference regarding how a traumatized brain can be retrained. So it speaks to what were the distinction between the 2 words you said? Restorative
And transformative.
Transformative, right. It's a transformative thing. She wasn't trying to be the person she was pre-sexual assault. She was incorporating her sexual assault into her identity and the way that she moved forward into a powerful way. There's like a reclaiming and an empowering that's new and there and useful.
Sarah?
I just wanted to bring a little bit more conflict transformation theory in, because it ties into some of these responses, I think. I mean, some of these are instinctive, and when the amygdala gets activated during trauma, sometimes there's no thinking brain there to really drive the car. So sometimes, even if you have all of this training, you may be completely hijacked, and that's just something to acknowledge.
But it's not a failure if you are.
It's not a failure on your
right.
part. You might even be watching it happen, and part of you is a little bit amused. It's like, but I trained for this. How is this happening? How am I triggered right now? But, so being gentle with it is important. But in terms of like the different types of resolution or transformation styles, however you want to call it, there's basically 2 axes. There's the consideration or concern for the goal, and the concern for the relationship. And there are 5 basic styles that fall along these. So if you have a high concern for the goal, like let's say the goal is to, disable this person and get out of the situation, then compete is the strategy.
Interesting.
And if you have a high regard for the relationship, like I really don't want this person to think bad about me, then accommodate, which is that fawn response.
Which is fawn response, yeah.
And I'm a default accommodator. And
Me too!
Yeah. And if you have a low regard for both the goal and the relationship, then avoider. So the turtle. Like, I'm just going to remove myself. That might be the flea,
Yeah.
Of course, some of this is cognitive and some of this is instinctive, right?
Yeah.
And then if you're the kind of person that wants to make everybody happy, you might try a compromise. So the compromiser is sort of middle ground between those things. You're trying to preserve the goals and the relationships. Unfortunately, in compromise, usually no one's happy completely because everybody had to give something up in order for the compromise to happen.
So the goal is to make everyone happy and everyone's miserable. That's
Or just like vaguely unsatisfied.
Sure.
And then the 5th one, which is the one that we often point to as being really desirable in a lot of situations, it's not always appropriate, but is collaborator. So trying to figure out the win-win for everybody. It involves a lot of strategic thinking and a lot of collaboration, a lot of willingness on the part of everybody involved. In the case of the person who's trying to assault someone, they're probably not on board for like a collaborative resolution strategy, right? So it might make a lot more sense to accommodate and get out of there, or to defend yourself, or whatnot. So depending on the situation, you might default to one of these responses. But I think even knowing that other options are available, and knowing what you're likely to do, what you have done in the past, and knowing that you have different choices, I think is really powerful.
So, to Erin, I am a pacifist. I teach ethics for a living. And for the record, I thought the "I've been training for this, I'm ready" response was actually kind of awesome. Just from the perspective that I draw a sharp distinction between a threat and actual violence. And so the point there was that the person was posturing in a way that reversed the tables. And I think that what's nice about it is that
there was no weapon involved that is relevant to the... Yeah.
So I think that part of it is that if we're trying to discourage mugging in the future, there is something to be said for that response might be the most effective at doing that. But I wanted to say something about compromise because a long time ago in a land far, far away, that was my graduate work, and it was using the book called Splitting the Difference by Martin Benjamin, in case anybody's curious. But Benjamin talks about kind of the requirements for a good compromise, and I think that this is related to safety in the sense that sometimes we compromise ourselves, right? That's the negative compromise. And when you engage in that kind of negative compromise, I think that you inherently feel less safe. But sometimes we engage in compromise as a process, right? And often compromise as process can help to build safety because it strengthens the relationship. And then you have compromise as outcome. So part of the thing that ends up happening is that often we talk about compromise either as I was compromised or compromise as outcome, but we very rarely talk about compromise as process and how to facilitate compromise as a process. So concrete example, right? Both of the other panelists feel comfortable with a moderator, right? And they don't want to be interrupted. Now, I'm Italian. I believe in overlapping conversations.
I'm Italian too.
And having a moderator makes me feel uncomfortable. But I'm like, okay, the two of them are going to feel more comfortable. I'm a person who is very comfortable in my discomfort, right? Like I'll speak anyway, even in uncomfortable situations. So that was a situation where we kind of went through a process, right? We each talked about, do we want a moderator? Do we not want a moderator? They said, yes, we do. And I was like, all right. And then the outcome was we had a moderator, right? Now, but the difference is I know both of these people really well. And we have continuing cooperative relationships, is how Martin Benjamin puts it. So for me to compromise on this one versus standing my ground and saying, no, we're not going to have a moderator, was okay with me because at the end of the day, I know them. I want them to be comfortable. I also know that if for some reason I mess up and overlap with someone, that they're not going to be like, you no longer out of this panel and you're never going to be on a panel again. That allowed for the compromise. Does that make sense? But here's the thing. In other situations, I could have felt compromised by this compromise.
And I was watching to see if that's what was happening. When we were talking about this, having a moderator, it was maybe like an hour before this thing started. I was like, okay, I need to get a sense of how important this is to Azzurra. Is having a moderator going to make her feel unsafe up there? Like, what are the stakes here for her? And when I heard you give the, I was like, okay, that is an acceptable level of discomfort for Azzurra.
What type of consent was that, Azzurra? You know all the different types. What type of consent is?
Well, I mean, I ultimately agreed, so I would say that it was active but not enthusiastic.
Yeah.
That was what my thought as well.
But it was important to me, because if you would have said, I feel unsafe up there with a moderator, I would have been like, all right, we don't need one. I will, yeah, you know.
But there was a certain amount of, we engaged in a process, right? We had an outcome. And notice that part of what we're both saying here is, it wasn't like there's two of them and there's one of us. It was we were all concerned for each other's safety and comfort, right?
Yeah.
So ultimately, the outcome, moderator or no moderator, was less important than one, the process, and two, the continuing cooperative relationship, and three, that none of us felt like we had to compromise ourselves in order to be able to continue. Right. So bringing this back to the conversation about a code of conduct, could we have a code of conduct that says moderators will always be there? That would then be alienating to people like me who love the fact that I just got interrupted twice. Like, that genuinely made me feel safer than if they had gotten on stack, right? And so if we have a code of conduct that says this must be moderated and nobody should be interrupted, I feel unsafe. But knowing that there was a process and that there was kind of a standard mode that we were going to be following, but also the possibility for deviation from it, without feeling like there was going to be a penalty, that to me was substantially more likely to increase safety than a strict enforced code of conduct, especially because in the compromise as process, I'm a willing participant in the creation of the situation, right? We had a conversation, all three of us spoke, and well, actually Harrison slightly too. I think he just kind of got voluntold that he was going to be a moderator.
I said, hi friend, we need you.
But look, and I'm not trying to belabor what may seem like a really simple point, because at the end of the day, this is a really silly example, but I'm using it as an example in order to draw out a larger conversation, right? Codes of conduct are usually created by a few people, and then everybody else has to either adopt by joining the group and tacitly consenting or maybe signing a contract, or choose to withdraw participation. But compromise as process is inherently something where everyone is involved in the conversation. And sometimes the process is actually more important than the outcome.
Yeah, so the rules aren't actually the point.
They are or are not?
Are not.
Are not. Very good.
The rules are important because they set the tone for the kind of community you're trying to create. But there are people that will take a rule and try to figure out how to bend it and push it. Rules lawyers, right? There are people that will look at a rule and it'll be a game to them to figure out how they can break it. So there are always going to be people that deviate from the group, and that's always something to look out for. But really what the Code of Conduct is intended to do, actually, is to say, we value safety in this community. And everyone in this community is agreeing to value one another's safety and to acknowledge that some people come from different positionalities. Some people have more privilege than others. Some people have backgrounds that are sensitive. And we will respond if someone acts inappropriately or makes someone else feel unsafe. And that feeling of safety is priceless. Now, again, there are people that read codes of conduct and feel the exact opposite. They're like, I feel totally unsafe now. I felt super safe in this community. I felt like I could trust everyone here. But now that there's this code of conduct, I feel like I'm going to be witch hunted. So it doesn't work for everyone.
That's how I feel about government. Get that into the...
That's how I feel about government.
I would love to get into that, but I first wanted to ask about consent, because I think a lot of, which actually ties into government quite nicely as well, I think that a lot of these topics have to do with consent, and there are ways in which we are, through our social structures, forced or coerced into situations that are not of our design, that are not intentional communities that we all had a say in collaboratively building together and deciding whether there's going to be a stack. You know, the stack was decided before we got here. And we don't even realize the degree to which those systems are running us at any given time in our conditioning. And so how do we establish, first of all, knowing what I actually want within those structures, being able to identify what that is when I've been told what I'm supposed to want for so long? And then how do I verbalize that and negotiate that with someone else? And then how do they receive that? I mean, that whole process, people want to be very simple, but it's actually quite complex and nuanced. And I know Azzurra has done a lot of research on this, and I would love to hear both of your thoughts, but especially if you could just break down the basic.
So let me get this straight. You're asking if I consent to talking about consent?
I am inviting you. I am making an offer.
So
would you like to dance?
So I think that, I can go through the definitions of consent. I've done it for those students who are in my ethics class. I've done it at the philosophy. One of them is. I've done it for the philosophy of love and sex talk that is still on our website. But what I actually think might be a more interesting concept to bring to the table is the notion of autonomy. So we normally think of autonomy as like the ability for me to be the captain of my own ship. And in philosophy, we draw distinctions between procedural notions of autonomy and substantive notions of autonomy. So a procedural notion of autonomy says, as long as I go through the right kind of process in making this decision, then whatever the outcome is, I autonomously chose it. Substantive notions of autonomy say that there are certain choices that cannot be chosen. So, for example, a high school student having sex with a teacher. Substantive notions of autonomy are going to say that that's not a choice that you're free to make because of the power dynamic that exists between a teacher and a student. Even if the student believes that she has made that choice, the student is not capable of making that choice. Whereas a procedural notion of autonomy might say, well, if the student goes through the process this way and the teacher goes through the process this way, then that is a choice that can be made. So when you're talking about tell me what I want, what I really, really want. How do I know what I really want? I mean, the Spice Girls seems to know, but there are definitely times in my life that I don't know, is this something that I authentically, genuinely, autonomously want? Or do I want it because I'm a woman who lives under patriarchy, or because I want to appease my partner who has been doing things to me that have been making me really uncomfortable, and so it's just easier to compromise myself in that way. Now, laying that as the background to then answer the question about consent. We can talk about active or affirmative consent. Usually the three conditions for that is it has to be informed, right? I have to know what I'm consenting to. I have to say or act in a way that indicates consent. And I have to be capable of consenting, right? So there has to be a freedom from coercion and also any sort of debilitation, right? So I can't be like drunk or high or underage, or a power dynamic might be a way of saying that you're incapable of consenting. Then you have tacit consent, which basically means that you don't say no. You have hypothetical consent. No one asked you, but if they had, you would have said yes. And then lately, activists have started to talk about enthusiastic consent, right? So, let's say for the sake of argument, she gives me this invitation to talk about consent. I say yes, right? And I start talking, but really, I didn't want to. I just did it because I'm up here and it would have been uncomfortable to say no, right? There's a cost to saying no. That would be a situation where affirmative or active consent would be present, but not enthusiastic consent. I said yes, but that's not what I really, really wanted, okay? So then that raises this really beautiful epistemic question. How am I supposed to know if you say yes that you really, really meant yes? Some of that can be done through body language, right? Oh yeah, I guess I can talk about consent. Clearly that's not a situation where I really want to, right? You can tell that from my body language, you can tell it from my
Assuming
tone.
that people can read those cues, but
Assuming that people can read those cues and that they can read them accurately, right? So one of the ways that we can build enthusiastic consent is that we can lower the price of saying no. So let's say that I'm like, hey, Erin, I would really like to kiss you. Say no.
No.
Why, thank you. I really appreciate that you let me know that that's not something that you're interested in doing. When was the last time that you thanked someone for saying no? Especially when it was something that you really wanted? That's not a practice that we have. And yet it builds safety, right? So if your, let's just go with sexual partner, asks you to, I'm just going to make up a word, fadiddle, and you're like, right? And you're kind of not answering, and they say something like, oh, well, it sounds like you're not really down to fadiddle. You can feel comfortable telling me that, but let's not fadiddle for now. I want to make sure that you're really enthusiastic about fadiddling. So when I'm talking about training and practice and embodiment and games regarding these issues, part of the reason that I say that is because we don't have scripts around consent. We don't have scripts around safety, right? When you think about kissing someone, how many times have you seen, just in Harrison Ford movies, kisses that are inappropriate? Right? Think about that first kiss between Han Solo and Leia, right? Totally inappropriate, completely violation of consent. How many times in our mass media do we see scripts of people negotiating consent in really constructive ways that build safety? You know, there were days that I really think that maybe what I should have gone into is making sex films. And I say this because I think that there is a lack of that kind of material that actively, consistently, philosophically, beautifully, and may I say in a sexually arousing way, shows scripts of consent. And we need that in order to know how to do it, right? Because if I've seen 100 times of Han Solo kissing Leia in a way that violates consent, and I'm a teenage boy and I've never kissed anybody before, and I want to know how to go about it, how on earth am I supposed to learn? A code of conduct may help me, but probably not, because it's going to usually tell me what not to do. It's not going to show me how to do it right. And for that, we need stories, we need theater, we need narratives, right? Because then you can say, oh yeah, I saw that person, and oh, that's how you do it. Okay, now I'm going to go home and practice. I'm going to take my pillow.
Sorry, I'm back. I'm here. You're good. I think of how cool it would have been if Harrison Ford had consent can be so sexy, you know? Like, had Harrison Ford looked at Leia and been like, can I kiss you? Not in like a kiss, can I kiss you? Like, not saying that, but like there's a way you can kind of check in with someone before you kiss them to get a sense, that would have been a beautiful way for that scene to go. You're not sacrificing anything. And to point, there's the teenage boy looking at all the aggressive kissers on screen, and then there's the teenage girl looking at all of the women doing things they don't really want to do. And then they're being asked, I think it's I think about myself as a teenager seeing all those women, and then I think about myself trying to navigate consent in relationships and sexual relationships, and me being expected to know what the heck I wanted when I was 17 or 18 or 19, I had no idea what I wanted. So of course I made mistakes. And I didn't know how to be in tune with myself. I had no training for being in tune with myself or my desires. I had a bunch of training for here's how to fawn over people to get the heck out of situations that are uncomfortable, you know? When that's your training, it's hard to advocate for yourself. So the informed consent thing is important, because informed it means that you know what you want, and you're not being conditioned, and you're not being forced, and you're not being anything. You're you've been taught to be in tune with the core of who you are. It's really hard to be taught to be informed, but ask any academic or any artist or any, actor, how did you get to where you are? It's well, I thought I wanted to do this, and then I tried it, and it was horrible. And I thought I wanted to do this, and thank God that didn't work, because it would have been horrendous, you know?
I always wanted to teach philosophy.
Well, we can't all be you. It's hard. It's hard. We need more. I am a big advocate of pop culture being awesome. Pop culture can really be powerful here.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the question of how do I know what I want? How can someone know what they want? And what I'm learning is there's what the mind thinks, which we're talking multiple layers of the mind. We're talking about rational thought, and then we're also talking about conditioning, which is unconscious. We're talking about what the heart wants, which may or may not be in alignment with what the mind is saying. And then there's a deeper knowledge. When you talk about the body keeping the score, there are ways in which there are parts of our body that we're not aware of that are actually communicating with us. And one of the modalities that I've been learning about is somatic experiencing. And this is actually a trauma recovery method that is quite useful, that allows people to actually go into those much deeper aspects of their self and to notice when their body is telling them a very clear no that is getting overridden by these other systems. And if you think about conditioning in terms of the goals of it, in order to keep society rolling in a certain fashion, the idea that there are certain scripts that we have learned that are specifically designed to override those systems is a little bit frightening.
Yeah.
And learning how to tap back into those systems and get all of those systems within yourself in alignment and figure out what you actually want from that place, that takes practice, it takes awareness, it takes time. So I think it's a worthwhile endeavor, but it really complicates the consent thing, because what you're saying might be not what. Real quick, before we jump into that, I want to make sure we cover boundaries and borders, because that was part of the description. And we have about 10 minutes, I think, before maybe we should open it to Q&A. So how do you feel about transition?
Just one very quick comment.
Okay, she's not ready to transition. See how that worked?
So my dear professor and friend at Texas A&M, Edward Murguia, once told me that a safety net is something that trapeze artists do in order, or use in order to be able to do better tricks. The idea is that a lot of times people say, oh, I want to go to a trapeze show without a safety net. But what you actually come to realize if you're into trapezing is that when you have a safety net, there are certain tricks that a trapeze artist will try, knowing that if they fall, they're going to be safe. So getting back to this question of what is safety, one of the ways that we can talk about it is the creation of a space such that mistakes can be made so that excellence can occur.
Excellence, pushing of boundaries, growth. Yeah, and that's what college is all about, right? It's creating those kinds of environments. But the question at hand is, if we can condense it a little bit, what do you think the difference between a boundary and a border is? We've been talking about boundaries, how to set boundaries in terms of consent.
I have a good answer to that.
Yes.
So the difference between a boundary and a border to me is that a border is enforced and patrolled, right? So talking about nation states, for example, right? Should we have a boundary between Austin and, say, Round Rock? Yeah, like I go and I see the sign that says, you have now entered Round Rock, you are leaving Austin. That's a boundary, right? But going from North Korea to South Korea and having to go through the militarized and the demilitarized zone, that's a border. And so that's how I define it. And I basically think that boundaries make us safer, borders make us less safe.
What is a boundary?
I think a boundary is a way of saying, here is one thing, and here is another, right? Whereas this is Austin, now we're in Round Rock, or this is what I consent to, this is the consensual space, this is the non-consensual space, and also the recognition that there is a border space or a boundary space, right? So and here I'm borrowing from Gloria Anzaldua's fabulous book, Borderlands, the notion that some of us exist in what she calls border spaces. So for example, as a person who was born in Italy but has predominantly lived my life in the United States, there's a way in which I'm both Italian and American, but there's a way in which I'm neither Italian nor American, right? So I'm Italian here and I'm American there. And so what has that given me? Well, it's given me this feeling of like not quite belonging that has, in a lot of ways, given me a context for understanding boundaries and being very comfortable in boundary spaces, right? Kind of like when they were saying earlier with the, like, how uncomfortable is she with this? Well, I kind of like lean into discomfort a lot. My yoga practice is really important to me for that. So like I have a higher threshold for discomfort than most people. And I think that some of that is something that I have sought out, but I think some of that has just been a response to the fact that I am often in boundary spaces. So that's kind of talking about it as geographical or physical boundaries. I think that when we're talking about interpersonal boundaries, what we're talking about is this is good, this is acceptable, this is squishy, and then this is, right, squishy being a highly technical term.
Yes.
And then this is unacceptable.
When I think about that second delineation, I think about autonomy, going back to that term. What does it mean to have physical and emotional autonomy? And again, when we're talking about conditioning, some of us have been conditioned not to perceive ourselves as autonomous beings. We've been conditioned to respond, fawn-like, to our environment in a pleasing way, in a way that nurtures others. And so it may be very difficult to even know where autonomy starts and ends. But for me, what a boundary is learning how to figure out where that membrane might be and figure out how to communicate it to others, not in a way that shuts them out, but in a way that keeps me in and helps me feel coherent. I've been learning this from spiritual practice that I've been involved in, but it's a really powerful concept. And I think that's a good, unless you want to make a comment on this?
I have one comment, which
Yeah.
is okay, so in that theater class, that great theater class where everyone was talking about themselves in an authentic, beautiful way, there was this debate where we read the vagina monologues, and a student said, "Hey, I'm a dude. Could I be in the vagina monologues? I feel like that would be cool." And half the room was like, "No, that play is for women. Only women should be performing it." And half the room was like, "Theater is about empathy. How cool would it be for a dude to think about how to authentically portray a woman?" And my professor said something that I'm never going to forget, which was, if you have been put down by the same group of people and you need a place to heal, it's okay to get together with people who have been hurt in the same way as you and sort of be together and heal together. Like, that exclusive space is okay. He went so far as to say the Vagina Monologues is an example of that, which I disagree with completely. It's a play. It's not a space for healing. It's a production of something. But like, a magical thing happens when trauma survivors get together and share and are close. I think that there's a potential for healing when, like, I think it's okay. Like when we talk about kicking people out or letting people in, like, I think that it is okay to get with a group of people that you feel safe with so that you can connect and heal. I think that that is, like, we can allow for that and allow for big, beautiful, amazing flowers that are so cool that the weeds aren't even a thing. And we can allow for that and have classrooms where debates are healthy and good and have live action role plays where, you know, like, I think that we can have codes of conduct, and also it's okay to get with your girlfriends and be like, oh my God, I've had a freaking day, and your girlfriends are like, oh, us too. Let's heal and be together because we kind of get each other. It's okay to have your people, I think is what I'm trying to say.
And just to piggyback on that real quick, that is one of the ways to heal trauma, actually.
I know!
Yeah.
And that the three of us are traumas, I think it's incredible. This was not planned, that the three of us would be trauma survivors.
But it's not unusual that people interested in safety have a background in trauma.
That's right. That is correct.
I do think that the vagina monologues is a healing space. I am also open to the idea of a man who has been traumatized by patriarchy wanting to join that healing space. But I think that one of the things that is near and dear to me that we have not yet spoken about in relation to this question of boundaries and borders is that when we think that we create safety by removing the, quote, bad people, where do they go? And, you know, I spent a lot of time with prisoners. I probably talk to at least one every day. And what I have found is that even in prison, you have a need for safety, right? Because it's a universal human need. And that putting people in cages surprisingly doesn't teach them how to be safer towards each other. And then eventually we let them out of the cage, right? And then we say, oh, and yet this person is now less safe to be around than they were before. So part of the reason that I kind of advocate for this changing of the behavior and the weeding out of the behavior early is because I want to live in a world without prisons because that's what safety looks like to me, in part because I don't want to be scared of going to prison, right? Like that's a pretty big fear. Solitary confinement, probably the scariest thing that I can think of. So for me to be safe, I want to live in a world without prisons, but I acknowledge that that's not something that's going to happen tomorrow in the sense that we need to have safe borders and safe boundaries and safe spaces, and we need to practice these skills that I'm talking about in order for that world to come into being. So I think that part of what we can do is we can have the creation of multiple spaces, right? So let's say for the sake of argument that you had a group that wanted to do the vagina monologues as a women-only, so performers only and audience only that were women. And we might have that as one production. And then we might have a separate production that allows for male and female audience members, but only women who identify as women, let's say trans-inclusive, as performers. And then we might have a third production that would allow for male performers. And so maybe the solution is not to say either or, exclusive or, but to say yes and, right? That we're going to create multiple types of spaces that will allow for people to be safe in different ways. Because I'm hoping that one of the things that you've noticed about this is that what makes people safe, let me put it this way, the need for safety is universal, but the conditions that allow for safety vary among people, right? Even with the very arbitrary example of moderator or not moderator, right? There's three of us, and we couldn't necessarily, and we didn't have
Consensus.
We didn't have like pure consensus regarding that. So what does that mean? Well, maybe next time we do this, we say, let's try it without a moderator. Or maybe we say, okay, this worked out well enough because this is kind of a trivial example, right? Or maybe it's the case that I'm going to need to go and be in an unmoderated space for most of my life in order to be in a place that feels safe to me or feels safer to me, right? Because at the end of the day, this isn't a toggle switch, it's a dimmer switch, right? We can talk about how to build safer spaces, as Sarah was talking about earlier, and that may mean having boundaries. It may mean having physical borders, like the vagina monologues that's women only is going to be in this room and you have to have your ID checked in order to be able to enter it or whatever, right? So in certain cases, it may be about the creation of a physical space. In certain cases, it may be about the creation of groups, plural, right? With the understanding that if there's going to be a variation, that's okay. So kind of getting back to the situation where Sarah is trying to create a live action role-playing scenario and has a code of conduct, and there are certain people who are put off by the existence of a code of conduct, should that worry us? If it's the same sort of marginalized folks who are constantly marginalized, maybe the answer is yes, more so. But let's say for the sake of argument that it is kind of the same group of folks and they're not marginalized folks. Well, maybe what they need to do is go create a different space that doesn't have a code of conduct, because that's what it's going to mean for them to be safe. Now, here's the kicker. The difference between a boundary and a border is that I can cross over a boundary, right? I can go from Austin to Round Rock. I can't cross over a militarized border. So part of what we've been talking about is autonomy and freedom of movement. We could also talk about it in terms of freedom of association. I think that freedom of association is something that is key to creating safe spaces. If I'm in a situation where I feel unsafe, let's say that I'm in a prison and I know that if somebody attacks me, whether or not I respond, I'm going to be maced and thrown in the hole for 7 days, which is something that happened very recently to someone who's very near and dear to me. Am I going to feel safe in that space? No. But if I know, okay, I have to be in a rehabilitative community, right, because I've done something wrong, but I have autonomy over which community, and I don't feel safe in this one, so I would like to be transferred to this other one, please. Does that now increase my possibility for safety? Yeah, because I have freedom of association. And if there's a group where nobody feels safe, then what's going to happen? There's only going to be one person there.
This microphone ran out of batteries, but we're going to transition to Q&A. So I will walk around with the microphone. Does anyone have a question they'd like to start us off with?
Or comment.
Or comment?
Or
Well,
story.
then, rock stars, you're alive and awake at the end of an hour and a half. I'm so impressed with you.
I'll start off with a very funny comment then. You mentioned splitting the difference. The quote that I said about rising to the occasion was from a book called Never Split the Difference. Not joking at all. It's a negotiation book written by FBI lead hostage negotiator. Questions, thoughts, comments?
So this goes back to what your the garden. You either pull the weed out. So the idea then is, if we are not pulling the weed out and then we just have all of these beautiful flowers, that we don't see the weed? Is that kind of where that is? Like the weed still exists?
What I was trying to say is that in communities where there are strong consent practices, where there is strong modeling of conflict resolution, the kind of sort of initial boundary pushing microaggressions don't get anywhere. So what psychologists have found sort of over and over again is that people who push boundaries will do so in one context but not in another, because what abusers are looking for is a person who's going to give them a victim response. So if you're really good at standing up for yourself and having really good boundaries, abuser comes up to you, they try their game, you respond in a, I'm ready for you and I'm going to fight you, and what do? They run away. So the idea behind the flowers metaphor was to say, okay, what does it look like for us to have communities where consent practices are entrenched, when conflict resolution practices are entrenched, such that the first time that you tell an inappropriate joke, it's not just on Harrison to respond, but we're all jumping all over each other to say that's not okay. You're not going to tell that joke again in that community because it's clear, and it doesn't necessarily require a specific code of conduct. It's that there is a price, right? There's a negative cost to your behavior, and it's a consistently applied negative response to your behavior. And human beings respond to conditioning. But if you tell 3 inappropriate jokes and nothing happens, and then when you tell the 4th even more inappropriate joke, all of a sudden you're being called up on conduct charges, there's a way in which you're going to be like, but what do you mean I didn't realize that I was being inappropriate? I mean, and maybe genuinely you didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes sense. So essentially, with all of that in place, the moment that a weed starts to poke its head up, it gets snuffed out. Like there's no room for the weed to even grow. That's where that metaphor is going.
Where I was going with it is that there's an immediate response to the behavior.
Okay.
That is a redirecting response, right? And please understand that in certain cases, you may have to do this more than once, right? Like, I didn't jump straight to having, okay, I mean, first of all, I didn't plan to have an entire class laugh at that student. For the record, that just happened. But had there been other attempts to moderate his behavior? Sure, right? So I had been consistently making that attempt, and then it turned out that I needed some roundup to deal with that particular situation. But there is something to be said for being proactive and consistent. And I think that part of the problem is that we live in a society where we're taught not to deal with our own conflicts. Government inherently doesn't want you to deal with your own conflicts. If you want a really good reading on this, I really like Conflict as Property by Niels Christie. And what he basically is arguing is that government doesn't want us to resolve our own conflicts. Government wants to appropriate your conflict, right? If I punch you and then I go to prison or I go to court, it's not Azzurra versus
Jessica.
It's the state versus Azzurra, right? The state has now appropriated our conflict. So the idea is that we don't live in a society that wants us to resolve our own conflicts, because if we did resolve our own conflicts, then we would realize that we don't need government. So our entire lives we've been told, we're on the playground and Erin kicks me. What am I supposed to do? Tell the teacher. And what's the teacher going to do? Come in and resolve the conflict, maybe in a way that is completely against what either of us would want, because now this person externally who wasn't there, doesn't understand what was going on, is imposing whatever, an infraction. That looks very different than Sara coming in as a conflict mediator and saying, now, Erin, why did you kick Azzurra? And it's like, well, you know, because she kicked me half an hour ago and I've been trying to get back at her ever since. Now imposing a punishment on her and not on me doesn't make any sense, right? And maybe the conversation needs to be like, well, but you took my toy, right? Yeah. And like we have to like yell it out and get to a point where we say, okay, now we're going to share this toy. Let's hug and move on, or whatever. But that's not how our system is put in place.
A thing I wanted to say is that's relevant here is I love the idea of being aggressive and asserting yourself, and I also am a millennial that's worked in corporate workplaces. Every time I've spoken up in those corporate workplaces, it's gone terribly. So like, there's this beautiful, amazing, you know, it should be the case that we are raising people to be assertive and aggressive and authentic. It's complicated though when you put them into, you know, like I thought I was doing the right thing in these corporate workplaces by being like, I have identified a problem. I can help fix it. And the bosses were like, you're fired. We don't want to deal with this, or you go away, you know? Like that there are, the idea that the conflict resolution can occur is true. A part of the conversation has to be preparing a person for it not working out well, I think.
Oh, I've definitely had plenty of those, and it doesn't have to be in a corporate work environment.
Yeah, no, it's everywhere.
I mean,
I
definitely currently have several situations like that at ACC.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, there's also something to be said for it doesn't have to be that dramatic, right? So let's go back to the person tells a joke that wasn't funny. I didn't think that was funny. Or even just glaring and not responding, right? Or turning and walking away, right? There are lots and lots of ways that you can withdraw participation, and to a certain extent, you're going to have to figure out your own style, right? Like, I tend to be pretty combative. for better or worse.
And being combative has gotten me fired, and I felt so like, as a millennial, I was like, no, they taught me to be authentic. They taught me to be honest. And I got fired for getting rare. And so, like, I love the...
Right, I mean, and I got kicked out of a co-op that we both lived in, but there's something to be said for, like, okay, then maybe that wasn't the right space for me. Like, do I regret standing up for the things that I stood up for?
Of course not.
Absolutely not.
Right.
Were there negative consequences? Yeah, because we don't yet live in the perfect world.
Yes.
But there's also something to be said for, sometimes I realize, like, oh, I brought a nuclear bomb and I really should have, like, just cracked an egg, right? That maybe I could have been substantially kinder, substantially softer in the way that I responded. And that goes back to this idea that these kinds of responses take practice. Right? So maybe the weed doesn't need for me to like go in and like put my foot down and, right? It just needed to be like flicked. And that would have been enough. And how can you know antecedently?
I just wanted to point out that I absolutely advocate for people learning how to manage conflict, how to resolve conflict, how to transform conflict. And there are certain situations where it can't be resolved one-on-one. And where there needs to be a mediator. Sometimes there needs to be legal mediation, and I know you don't agree, but there are times when sometimes it's dangerous for someone to be in interaction with somebody. And I just want to acknowledge that that exists, and often if we put the onus on people, well, you can just resolve it between the two of you, that actually can make marginalized folks feel even more marginalized because of the fawn response. So I just want to point that out.
Yeah, and actually, I'm in agreement with that. So for the record, I don't have any problem with legal mediation. What I have a problem with is the state's alleged monopoly on violence and the threat of violence, right? Because I want to live in a nonviolent world. So the idea that we're going to create safety by punishing people and by excluding them from our communities in some sort of permanent fashion, that's my issue. Now, are there times that you can't handle a conflict on your own? I mean, if it's Erin kicking me in the play school recess, we probably, as a matter of fact, can resolve that conflict. But I mean, look, even biblically, it's go to the person, speak to them and say that you have a problem. If that doesn't work, gather 3 people, go and speak to them again. And then if that doesn't work, bring them in front of the whole of the church, right? So taking that out of a Christian context and trying to make it into more of a public reason sort of context, it might be the case that you realize, like, no, this is not somebody that I can speak to on my own. I need a mediator. I need multiple people to help me through the process. And it may be the case that we need them to be leaned on a little bit, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all type of solution, right? Every conflict is different. There are salient similarities.
That's what I wanted to get at, yeah.
But each solution ought to be particular to the conflict, to the people in the conflict, and to the desired resolution.
I just wanted to say 2 things. One, back to the safety net thing. This is just like a statement to add on, but
great.
A child that fears failure is a child that will not learn.
Yes! Yes, yes.
And continuing, in the Bible, in the very first part of the Bible, God, he talks all this stuff about how he created autonomy, but he doesn't let you use it. And so it's like, if you grow up Christian, you're basically being told your entire life how to be subservient. And that can add on to, people's fears of autonomy is not only with like social cues, but also your religious culture.
Absolutely.
Well, and that can create really unsafe spaces, right? Like if I'm being told that I need to submit to my husband, or my priest or whoever, right? That creates all sorts of opportunities for complete and utter lack of safety. I will say that if you're interested in these sorts of questions, I would highly recommend taking philosophy of religion, because it turns out that there is a multitude of philosophical interpretations of what it means to have free will and what it means to submit to God. And that's a conversation that I would be happy to have in a different context. But let me just say that just because you were raised in one tradition, please understand that there is a plethora of ways of interpreting these concepts. It's some that you might find more palatable.
But I just want to make clear that there's a distinction between the values of a religion and the original doctrine of a religion and the way that certain groups use a religion as a tool of control to create the very response that you're discussing. So sometimes there's a total mismatch even between what's doctrinally being said and what's being enforced. And that's something to look at in terms of these larger conversations that we're having around how we are conditioned to not value our autonomy, to not trust our choices, to think of them as problems, to pathologize our choices, and to trust an external authority to tell us how we're supposed to be. That's there for a reason.
There's a whole bunch of people who in corporate America, right? You and your coworkers are all like, yeah, we're all screwed. We can't speak up. We can't do anything. But we need this job for our health insurance and to not be homeless. So, yes, I will be the perfect good corporate worker who won't speak up about injustices, to the point where, like, if my company's asking me to do something illegal, I will do the illegal thing because I need this job, kind of thing. So, like, you know, it's all, yeah, it's and yeah, when you're a minoritized person outside of the corporate environment, that makes it even more complicated and difficult and icky and bad. So yeah, it's all complicated. More comments and questions, please.
I just wanted to say that, earlier we were talking about more so the authoritarian implications of religion, but I also feel like while that can have negative connotations in it, and this is like the age-old question whether this is societal influence or whether how we are as a basis of humans is how much authoritarian power and influence can also have a positive aspect on it, on us. For an example that I was thinking of is the Me Too movement. Without you could almost argue that it is not authority in like a literal way, like as a higher standing, but the idea of authority of having a group of people influence you. As more and more people come out, that became the majority overcoming another authority, I feel like, which is an interesting topic that could be discussed.
May I? I think that there's a difference between leadership and authority. So leadership is important to building safety because sometimes there are people who don't feel comfortable doing something unless there is a leader, right? There are some people who just feel more comfortable following, but leadership is granted in consent, right? Whereas authority is taken, I think, without consent. So when you talk about the Me Too movement, one of the ways that I think that the Me Too movement has, in various iterations, by the way, because it existed long before the hashtag. Just wanting to pay my respects there for a moment to the history of it. But one of the ways that the Me Too movement has created safety is that it has reopened spaces to have certain conversations, right? So it has given leadership. But has it taken authority? I don't think so, right? There hasn't been individual people who have now tried to come in and say, okay, now, in order for us to end sexual assault, this is what we're all going to have to do. And I think that that's important, is the recognition that human beings, I think, need leadership. Some people are more comfortable in leadership roles than others. That can be something that rotates, right? We can talk about different systems of leadership. Leadership, good. Dictatorships, authoritative structures. One of the major differences is that authoritative structures don't want to be questioned and they don't invite questioning. And we didn't talk about this up until now, but I think that one of the ways that we build safety is by fostering questioning, right? So if you have a leader who shuts down questions and being questioned, that person isn't a leader, they're an authoritative figure. And at that point, that's, I think, a moment where we have to step back and say, wait a minute, this is probably not an environment where I'm going to be safe. And then if enough people leave that authoritative figure, then they're just an authority over themselves and they have no power.
Do you feel honored? Do you have a response?
Yeah, I guess I Yeah, I agree with that. And I guess, I'm so sorry.
Don't be sorry. You're processing and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Please keep talking.
Before, I guess what I was trying to say is that my version of authority was synonymous with leadership.
Yeah.
I didn't mean authority in like a dictatorship way. I meant it more in like a primary, I suppose, is the best way that I could like describe it. Like a primary aspect of a group of people, like the focus of the group of people, I suppose, is what I meant more accurately.
And power, too.
Yeah, and power.
Yeah, like when just like every woman ever said, yup, that's been happening for years, y'all. Yeah. That was very powerful because it made, this is a community all of a sudden. And there were a ton of beautiful human beings who did not identify as women who went, holy crap, all of you? And that created like really cool, this is just, yeah. I think if given the definitions that Azzurra presented, you resonate with leadership, you resonate with power, yeah. There's no authoritarian wackiness in the Me Too movement right now.
Yeah, I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, the crazy feminists are taking over. I'm not like that at all.
I would love that. That would be great. I want all the crazy feminists to take over and see what happens. That'd be good times, I feel like. More comments, please.
I just wanted to comment on what Azzurra was talking about in terms of holding leadership accountable. Like there has to be some sort of accountability process to be able to say, hey, this thing that happened I wasn't okay with, and the leadership to be responsive to that. Now what the response is may not be what you desire, right? And that happens sometimes, right? But if someone not only doesn't listen to what you have to say, but actively pushes farther their authority on you, that's a really big red flag. Yeah. Because that's when your autonomy is being shrunk, essentially. And this is one of the things that happens in abuse dynamics. When people are, like that boundary pushing we were talking about, it may seem kind of harmless at first, but it's a way to gradually push on those boundaries of autonomy until the person no longer feels safe enough to express them. And so I think that can happen in those communities. There can be people that behave in that way. But I think overall the goal of that movement in particular is to get people to come out of that space and feel more and more comfortable asserting their autonomy and their boundaries.
So I wanted to go back to talking about Erin getting fired.
Yeah, yeah.
And here's what I wanted to say, right?
Yeah.
There's a problem. Erin voices it.
Yes.
The resolution to the problem is to fire Erin.
Fired. Yeah.
Okay, now Erin leaves.
Yeah.
But let's say that she becomes a fly on the wall in that corporate office. Did the problem leave when Erin left?
No.
The problem usually intensifies, right?
And the two people involved in the problem, they got fired after I got fired.
So point of what ends up happening is that when we're talking about building safe spaces, my concern on a theoretical level is if we say, you're the problem, we get rid of you, then it becomes, okay, now that we've gotten rid of Erin, but who else is the problem? We get rid of those two people. Okay, now those two people got fired. Do you think the problem has resolved? No, because that space has become toxic, right?
Yeah.
So you can eliminate someone. That's not going to necessarily create safety because it's the dynamics and the scripts and the culture that have created these problems. So that's why I'm talking so much about early intervention, right, with the initial weed, because that means that the culture, right, whether you're talking about an office or a classroom or whatever, has, for lack of a better way of putting it, a really healthy immune system, right? So that when one bad joke happens and it's immediately dealt with in this sort of reaction, then, like, we're inoculated. The second bad joke isn't going to happen. So what I would say, Erin, is, sometimes getting fired is an opportunity to go to a better place, right? Like, you're here teaching now, and we appreciate you. But sometimes it's also the case that, yes, are there going to be people who build safety, in big, squarey air quotes, by shooting the messenger or limiting what they see as the symptom of the problem? Sure. But does that actually build the kind of substantive notions of safety that we've been discussing here tonight? My argument to that is no. We're just shuffling those people around to somewhere else where they're going to continue those kinds of toxic behaviors, and those communities might be even less prepared to deal with it. So specifically in activist spaces, right? People get kicked out of activist spaces all the time. I've been banned from, I don't know, 3 countries worth of anarchist spaces at one point, and because clearly I'm unsafe, right? But what ends up happening, it's then you move on to a different activist space, and you might even be more dangerous there, right? So I'm thinking of a particularly Austin example, right? Brandon Darby, who is a well-known, very unsafe activist. I'm not going to belittle that, but there's a movie about it, Better This World. If we kick him out of like our activist space, and he goes on to some other activist space that isn't warned and is now able to start all of this behavior all over again, that can potentially create more danger. Now, I'm not saying that that means that we should keep him in our activist space, right? Like, please understand. But what I'm saying is that we may need alternate solutions, right? Whether that's a danger warning signal or something else. And I don't have a good answer to that particular question for the record, but I at least wanted to put it on the table.
And we have 2 minutes left. Any?
Really?
Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you for the presentation. I arrived late, so I don't know what you have talked before I arrived, but the topic of the presentation for today was talking about borders and boundaries. So my mind was focusing on something else compared to what I've heard during the discussion, but towards the end you mentioned a little bit about this issue. I am coming from geographic point of view, so I had a very particular interest on the boundaries and the borders. So you gave an example between these two terminologies, like someone going from Austin to Round Rock may have a blurred kind of boundary where you don't feel the exact turning points. But the other example, which is like a borderland, a boundary, the border is more sharper, which is happening in a place like between South Korea and North Korea. So you also mentioned that we need to have our border boundaries so that we should protect that one from being invaded by the other. So we have to protect, push. So if everybody is trying to make his own perimeter, right, and instead of accommodating the other side and then develop a kind of resilience to how to coexist, how to handle, if everyone is pushing one against the other, what would be the ultimate end result? Because an individual will remain very much isolated from one another. There would be almost no common denominator even to interact. So isn't it like something which you don't like it, but the necessary evil that you need to have some space to allow something to come in so that you may find out a way to coexist instead of creating some kind of sharper boundary and then pushing something which is not needed. Yeah.
So I'm not particularly fond of necessary evils. I pretty much reject them almost all the time. I don't believe in nation states. I don't believe in those kinds of borders, right? And so I was kind of talking about that in terms of the freedom of association part of that I think that people should be able to move, wherever they want to. So I want to be able to travel from here to China and not have to go through a checkpoint. But part of it is that I think that we have this idea that by being in Texas or by being in the United States, and that building a wall between Texas and Mexico is somehow going to keep us safer. And I don't think walls keep us safe. I don't think that militarized borders keep us safe. I think that building relationships, building community, and having the types of tactics and strategies that we've been talking about, that builds safety. So that's why I see those two conversations as being interrelated, right? So if we're talking, for example, about accepting refugees into our communities, which is entirely more controversial than it ought to be, as far as I'm concerned, what I would say is, of course, refugees should be able to come. Why? Because they're fleeing a really bad situation, and what allows for that bad situation to remain bad is that people are stuck in it, right? If you're being an evil dictator and everybody leaves, then you're just an evil dictator over your own self. But why don't people flee dictators? Well, because other people don't give them a place to go. Because we're trying to somehow say that they are going to make us less safe. And that just isn't true, I don't think, right? Now, do we need communities? Do we need connection? Do we need relationships? Do we need to make sure that people's immediate needs are being met? Yes. Do militarized borders achieve that goal? On my view, absolutely not. So you're right that we didn't talk about the geopolitical notion of border perhaps as much. We were more focused on interpersonal and specific personal connections, which maybe a follow-up talk could do more to talk about it in terms of the geopolitical borders. We had a couple of people that were supposed to be on the panel that ended up not coming that were, I think, intended to speak more to that. But I personally see the personal and the macro as being completely interconnected, right? In the same way that I would welcome you into my home, I want to be able to welcome you into my community, right? And, you know, should we have communities? Should we have the ability to include and exclude community members in certain cases? Sure. That may be something that we need, but do they necessarily need to be a militarized border? I know that you had a comment, and I see you packing up, so I just want to make sure that you get included.
I was just going to say pretty much what you just said, like that's what allies are for. You know, you have your own boundaries and they have their own boundaries, but then you form relationships, and when your boundaries are threatened, your allies will come protect your boundaries for you.
Yes.
And they're not giving up their own boundaries to protect them.
Yep. Preach, friend. Preach.
And I just wanted to kind of follow up on what you were saying. The micro affects the macro. So a lot of what we've been discussing, even if we're discussing very specific kinds of contexts, actually apply to larger contexts as well. The conflict resolution styles that we were discussing, those can be applied at structural levels. They can be applied at international levels. Boundaries, when we're talking about autonomy and interpersonal boundaries, that can be, you know, in intimacy, or it can be in large-scale dynamics. So one thing to consider is the way that we often look outward to try to understand things and look outward to conflict as happening here. And what I like to invite is to think about where conflict happens here and how that mirrors what might be happening out here. And so thinking about safety, for example, and boundaries and borders, when you're talking about walls, I'm agoraphobic, so walls absolutely make me feel safe. I freak out when I don't have walls sometimes. And I think there's a lot of people that feel that way. You know, will the wall necessarily protect me? Probably not if certain sets of circumstances happen, but it gives me this illusion of safety. And so understanding that we all have that human need that we're discussing and different people respond to it in different ways may help us understand these larger global dynamics.
So if I can just have one quick response to that.
I will note that we're 5 minutes over.
They're not going to kick us out for another 10. So why do I know this? Because I sometimes push boundaries of time. So
No.
I really want to get away from the model of, in order for me to be safe, the bad people need to be over there. I don't think there are bad people, right? I started out by saying the line between good and evil runs through all of our hearts. So the notion that I'm somehow going to be kept safer by excluding refugees and having a militarized wall, I think is a false notion. It's an illusion of safety that actually creates more danger than it prevents. And I just wanted to make sure that that was clearly stated.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. You are incredible. Us just talking is nothing, so yeah. You're allowed to run away.
I understand the whole boundaries and the safety, and I'm with that. I'm with you. I'm not going to China, but I want to go from here to China without checking and taking my shoes and my belt off and all of that. And I was just going up the road. But my take is the only true safety in this life is accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Okay, that's my take. Now, the other part about the boundaries, what they're really worried about is the crazies that slide in with the good folk that's trying to flee that trouble, the crazies that slide in. And you know why, and not to disrespect and not to dishonor anybody, but after the mass shootings, you know why they go all through the people's stuff? So they're trying to figure out a pattern. You know why you can't find a pattern? Because when you're in H-E-B buying a candy bar and a soda, the mass shooter's in the line over there, and you can't tell the difference because he looks human. He's not looking crazy and distraught and whatnot. Even in Scripture, you know, Jesus said, one of y'all going to betray me. They didn't say, Judas, get that joker. They said, is it me, Lord? Like, do I not know myself well enough? You know, so that's the boundaries come because there's the crazies that slide in.
So I think that we talk about it as the crazy or the shooting behavior in this moment, but we're not talking about all of the opportunities that people had to intervene in that person's life up until that point that were missed opportunities, right? So you don't go from being a completely well-adjusted person to being a mass shooter in 10 seconds. That doesn't happen, right? There were lots and lots of times and opportunities where someone could have intervened in that person's behavior and that people didn't, right? With all of these shooters, consistently what you hear is they were bullying other kids in school, right? That they were getting expelled, that all of this other stuff was happening and that nobody intervened. So the idea that we're somehow going to keep our community safe from these kinds of actions by keeping foreigners out, the truth of the matter is we've got these people in, right? So we need to address the behavior, not think that there is evil people. And from a Christian perspective, right, I'm a sinner. I'm not supposed to judge other sinners. And I'm supposed to believe that everybody is capable of redemption. So if I say, oh, that person is bad and needs to be kept out, that's not consistent with a Christian ideology either.
No. And I'm agreeing with you, but it's just the soul snatchers, you know, and the death dealers, we can't determine them. Like you say, there's a whole group of people running from some real crap. You know what I'm saying? But, you know, the authorities say, oh, no, they're going to bring in some. We got more dangerous folk right here on the ground than coming from anywhere. We got danger, and we don't know who they are because when I'm watching the TV after the mass shooting, he was a nice guy. We played checkers together. We played cards. We drank rum together. So it wasn't, oh, man, he was crazy from day one. You know what I'm saying? So we can't.
And that's a great discussion to be able to have, but we're so out of time. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. You are wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Run away.